physical manifestation of a park, but also the programs and the recreational side of things. There's certainly an underlying ecological component of our parks, especially when we're doing it right. And there's pollinators, et cetera, and how people can interact in that ecology or in that green space is really important. And plenty of studies that talk about mental health and well-being of being in those kind of ecologically rich places. Value and investment, there is definitely a correlation between the success of our parks and the success of our communities. Economically, and in the case of Fresno, we talked a lot about positioning a park system as part of an economic growth strategy for that community. As industries grow, as jobs grow, as high-speed rail happens, what's the thing that attracts people to that community and keeps them in that community? And certainly about our kids, about our people, again, through those programs. And how do we create a generational shift to keep people in our communities and grow our kids in healthy ways. So back to 2016 to really start this story. The city of Fresno, and this is before our time with the city, just really wanted to kind of show the course that the city began to take with their general plan, where they decided not to keep growing, but instead to really focus on infill, to begin to focus on transit, focus on their existing communities. You know, great work downtown, high-speed rail coming in. And I think what really started to shift was that there was just a real recognition of the historic inequities within the community, largely in a north to south kind of a spectrum. There was also just a lot of realization that the park system was not in great shape, just had really been neglected. And so some of the things that we found when we began our work just a year or so later was really just the poor condition of parks. And this is where you could start to imagine, you know, these are almost brownfields. You know, they need that same kind of a strategic approach to transform them into something different. And so that's kind of the story that we want to tell. Important here is also the Trust for Public Lands ParkScore Index, which is just a great metric that TPL employs across the country. And I was actually kind of fortunate because Fresno was dead last in that. The amount, the ability for folks to access a park and the acreage ratio of parks to people really put Fresno in an unenvious position. But there was also pretty great political motivation to really launch a parks master plan and to really begin to change that dynamic. And at the same time, folks in the community were recognized that it's going to take some money, it's going to take some resources, and they were already beginning to organize, as we're going to share just a little bit more about. So the Parks Master Plan came in and really brought a data-driven approach to the situation, to how do we turn our park system around. We led very detailed site assessments. We led a lot of analysis mapping that I'm going to share in just a minute here. And you know, a Parks Master Plan is the tool that a city or a municipality uses to really set out the course. What's the vision? What are our priorities? What is this going to cost to really bring the change and the value to our park system that we want? So some of the maps and some of the data-driven approach that we employed here is a map that identifies the walksheds of parks, and these green blobs are city streets in a network that allows folks to walk to a park. And some of these are very small because maybe there's a railroad track or a freeway or there's no streets in an area, and so that park doesn't serve as big of a district. Some that were quite large because there's a great connectivity, as an example. The black dots are parks that were in okay condition, and the red dots were parks that were in such poor condition that we couldn't identify a value for those parks. And you can see that some of those red dots actually have great connectivity, and some of those dots are in dark pink areas, which is high population areas. So we were really starting to make a very clear case that there are huge areas of the city that are not served by a park at all. There are areas of the city that are served by a really incomplete park. So we begin to think about how do we start to close the gaps, there was poor condition? Could we look at other ways to bring new land into the park system? We also just recognized, based on population projections, we're going to need a lot of additional acreage just to be able to serve this population. That comes at a big price tag, and that was definitely something that the community had to grapple with. This kind of a heat map is similar to the last one, and in red starts to identify some communities of concern. So we indexed a number of factors, including population density, but also health metrics, Cal and Virus Screen, to begin to understand, like, what are some of these really high target areas of the city that really need new parks, and how can we start to close the gap? So we looked at, well, what if we partnered with the school system? We could just open up schoolyards, and then we did the network analysis for those sites. So you can really start to see, like, wow, that's a pretty easy approach, joint use agreements with schools. We also looked at flood control basins, and the city is now moving ahead with a number of these flood control basins in order to just bring new park resources. This was a process that was heavily rooted in the community, lots of meetings in all council districts at multiple phases, a lot of community partners and advisors to the process. And there became kind of a critical point where we had all this data. We put the data out in front of communities across the city's geography in areas that were experiencing these lack of parks and experiencing the disinvestment, but also in neighborhoods which had a lot of park resources. Shared the same data with them, and the folks that were disinvested for so long were like, finally you're telling us like what we've been saying for a long time. And in those communities that were much wealthier, they looked at the data and they said, we don't need more parks. You got to put some parks over in that part of your community, in those other neighborhoods. So there was this great consensus that came out of this data-driven approach to begin to prioritize where investments should go. But that overall, if we didn't have more money, like, we got to just stick with what we have. We've got all these poor condition parks, and we need to invest in them. And that was just a really important clarity that came out of the plan. We talked about these kind of low-end investment strategies of, instead of the brown building that kind of looks like a Burger King, how could that be enlivened, simply with paint and repair, really just trying to make a case for transformation. Whether this is the Rotary Prison Center or the Rotary Sports Center, we didn't try to argue with that. But how, Gorbachev, can we tear down these fences? Can we open up and make a much more welcoming kind of a place? So these graphics were pretty helpful. And in the end of the day, it was we need a lot more money for maintenance. This is not a bond measure. Like, you're not going to be able to use a lot of traditional financing in order to fund capital. Like, yes, you have a lot of capital improvements, but you really need to maintain your park system with a bigger budget. And there's a lot of life cycle replacement. So, a really heavy investment strategy and an understanding of the total cost of ownership that went into that plan. So we ended the Parks Master Plan there, and as consultants, we do our work, we do our advocacy. Sorry, the 5 minutes is for me, or? Gotcha, okay, thank you. I was like this, I felt like the person in the lightning round yesterday. It was like, what? Okay, great. Advocating for reinvestment. So enter stage left, Sandra Celadon from Building Healthy Communities. So as the consultant, we had done our work, we did our advocacy, we didn't get fired by really pushing a message of park investment over maybe police and some other things within, there were other priorities within the city at the time. Sandra had been working for a lot of years as an advocate for parks and as an advocate for disinvested communities within Fresno. She couldn't join us here today, but she's helped us with this presentation, and is really I think a celebrity champion within the community. And this is actually a bus ad that Building Healthy Communities placed on buses at some point during some of their campaigns to really make a case for equity. Also, don't have to get into the details of this, but this is a timeline of a lot of the advocacy back to 2010 and all the way to passing a tax measure that Peter's going to be talking about next. Just the the consistent efforts along the way to identify needs and to kind of rally a community and build capacity within a community. And I think that's just what's necessary if you're going to turn a park system around, or you're going to turn a town around, or you're going to start to invest more broadly in contaminated sites or brownfields, is, who are your community partners? Because as a government agency or as a consultant, we can't do this. We have to rely on our community advocates and partner closely. And in the case of building healthy communities, when we were hired by the city, I would say they were not our allies by any means. They were like, what are you going to do, consultant? Or, whose line are you going to toe? And that's where we towed a data line. And in the end, I think everybody ended up on the same page, and we remain really close with building healthy communities. I take that to a testament to everybody coming together around a kind of a common challenge. So building healthy communities just led, really amazing outreach and really teed up how are we going to respond to this Parks Master Plan that laid out just incredible need, incredible history of disinvestment based on segregation practices in the past, based on continued disinvestment today. How are we going to really turn this around? And they put together a measure and ultimately prevailed. So Measure P is it's a tax measure that I'm going to hand it over here to Peter to explain that a little bit more. But really led this effort, and it's now signed into law. Hopefully that was the suspense.
Thank you, John. So I'm Peter Winch, also with WRT. We're colleagues in the same firm. I'm a planner and come from a background, working in comprehensive plans and general plans, and it's all very high level. But I've always had a really strong interest in public space, the public realm, streets, parks, schools, partly because I recognize the opportunity for multiple public benefits to accrue if we do good things with public land. And something that's been extremely gratifying about this project in particular is we've been able to stick with the process after the planning is done and work with the same community to implement it. And it's been extremely gratifying. And so I'm going to start to dive into what that looks like, what Measure P is, and what it's beginning to mean for Fresno. So Measure P was a half-cent sales tax, 50-cent sales tax that is bringing in something like, I think, $50 million to the city per year, and it's allocated into these buckets, and about half of it is allocated to existing parks, and that's been what John has been primarily presenting about is the poor condition and the great needs of the existing park system. But there's another chunk, about 21%, which is allocated to new parks. That's also important. There's a huge shortage compared to sort of typical standards, what we expect to see in communities, and you could see that in the walkshed maps that John showed as well. So there's a new parks component as well. There's also money for arts and culture, for trails and greenways, and for youth and seniors. So really trying to span the range of recreation needs that the community has. And critically, and what I'm about to get into in more detail, the measure requires that the city allocate at least 50% of the funds to highest need neighborhoods. And highest need neighborhoods could have just been left there, like, okay, there's a term, figure it out. But the measure actually defines what highest need neighborhoods means to a certain extent. The measure itself took that definition to a certain point by defining, I think it's A through K, so it's about 11 factors which define highest need neighborhoods. And we came to call these equity factors. And I want to kind of focus on that aspect of it because I think it's a good tie to the subject of this conference, disinvestment in communities, disinvestment in sites in older communities particularly, that this park that this new source of parks funding should be focused on areas of the community that have experienced disinvestment. So there's this parallel opportunity and funding stream for reinvesting in parks in the same communities that we're all trying to reinvest in through land reuse. So these equity factors were the condition of the parks, parks within a half-mile access, park acreage per 1,000 people, population density, youth and senior population, neighborhood safety, poverty, pollution burden. This is a Cal Enviro screen, so a state measure. And then some County of Fresno measures having to do with public health. So preterm birth rates, years of potential life lost, and mortality rate. And the idea is that all of these things are connected to parks and are related to how people, the opportunities that people have to be healthy, fundamentally. Also, I want to sort of re-emphasize here the mapping. And a lot of work was done, obviously, to create these maps. But it also, I think, continued to build the trust that the community was having in this process because it shows transparency and a data-driven approach. So we put all those factors together, and we worked with a committee that had been established to help the city implement this measure. And we first, with that committee's input and with the larger community's input, were able to create a composite map of highest need neighborhoods. And those are shown here in the sort of pale orange color. And you can see that those highest need neighborhoods are really clustered in the center of Fresno. And that's what we would have expected, and it indeed is what the data bore out. But we also took this to the next step, which is now that we've identified the highest need neighborhoods, how do we prioritize specific parks to invest in? So we went through another criteria-based, data-driven process using relevant metrics that were both technical, having to do with the condition of parks and things like that, but also community-based, having to do with what the priorities that the community voiced around which parks should be invested in. So that was also taken into consideration. And you can see the circles here are representing the parks that scored high in that combination of factors. And you can see that some of them are in highest need neighborhoods and others are not. And the measure does provide funding for both. We also looked at how do we prioritize locations for future parks? And remember that the measure allocates funds for both existing parks, making them better, making them not like prisons, but feel welcoming and exciting, but also for creating new parks. And so we went through a similar criteria-based process to think about and identify areas of the city where new parks would be especially needed. And that's really where it's really where the gaps are. And we took some other things into consideration as well. Pipeline projects, areas of the city that had gone through neighborhood planning processes and had identified existing parks. You can see a sort of a catch-up-y area in the southeast. There was another sort of parallel individual park advocacy effort underway in Southeast Fresno for a park on Peach Avenue those advocates came, they were part of the process, they made sure that park opportunity was represented as well. The measure also gave us an opportunity to think about not just investing in specific individual parks or in specific new locations for new parks, but what are the kinds of ways we can invest across the system to elevate the entire park system in ways that will benefit the entire community in terms of public health and in terms of resilience, and in terms of just community cohesion, creating an environment of greater safety. I'm going to shift gears now to the neighborhood scale, where we can start to see that sort of citywide planning for the park system, sort of how does that intersect with neighborhood-based, neighborhood-focused planning efforts. Around the same time we were working with the city on the Parks Master Plan, we were also working on an EPA area-wide planning grant-funded program. Shout out to EPA. Really good program. Wonderful opportunity to step back from the individual site assessment, cleanup, remediation side of things, which is extremely important, but dial back to how do these sites influence the neighborhood around them? How do they act in tandem when there's a whole grouping of potentially contaminated sites? What does that mean for the neighborhood? So we did a neighborhood-based planning process for the Elm Avenue corridor in South Fresno. Very, very disinvested community, very prevalent brownfield sites in that community. A lot of vacancy, a lot of poverty, a lot of need. And we worked in that community and worked with some specific potential partners, catalysts, who could try to start getting things going. And the most effective of those, the most involved of those was a church called St. Rest. And so we were working with them specifically to think about and begin to conceptualize and plan a campus expansion for them, well, just building out their site. They owned a large piece of property to include some of their other goals. It could include housing, it could include a food distribution center, and it could include public open space. So we started to show that on plans and get the community excited about it. But that was still kind of long-term planning. What really came out of that, I think, that was exciting was the community got together and we supported this effort in creating just a temporary plaza on a vacant part of their property on a prime corner in this community. And it became just this very special gathering place. It got a little bit of attention in the city of Fresno, in the Fresno press, and I think became a source of neighborhood pride, and hopefully a step along the way to revitalization in that neighborhood. But there's another opportunity that's much, much larger that I would say Measure P kind of opens up new pathways for. And that is the example I'm showing here is the Mary Ella Brown Recreation Center. It's okay, it's not in terrible condition, but it's pretty institutional, it's pretty limited, it's missing a lot of opportunities in what that site could provide in a neighborhood with a lot of need. And so our Parks Master Plan had shown what that could be like with the addition of an aquatic center and just building out that to a full-fledged community center the way it really could be. And I would say Measure P now creates the opportunity and recognizes this as a neighborhood of high need and this particular park as a particular park opportunity site, that there's now funding available potentially to start doing projects like this. I'll move over to another community in Fresno to show a different kind of example. This is the Tower District. Tower District is actually a really kind of a model of urban revitalization. It's got a lot of people who love it and have stuck with it, even as a lot of Fresno neighborhoods have struggled and struggled and struggled. And Tower has its own struggles, but it's really a neighborhood. The story there is much more of one of success and inclusion and a diverse community that has stuck with that place. What the Tower District doesn't have is parks. So it shows, you can see the reddest part of this map with a black outline around it, that's the Tower District. So interestingly, even though this neighborhood is quite successful, it's very, very park deficient. And Measure P and the analysis done for how to allocate Measure P funds is really showing how that neighborhood really is worthy of new park investment. And of course, the challenge in that case is there is very little undeveloped public land. It's just, it's almost non-existent. It's a complete community in that way, except for the parks. So in this case, we really do need to look at small sites, river corridors. There's a little creek that goes through it. Plazas, community gardens, non-traditional park spaces that can fit on smaller sites. And that's really where land reuse comes in, and probably the opportunities for new parkland in the Tower District may come from land reuse and may involve some remediation. We did a lot of work with the community, so there's a lot of excitement, and I think there will be future park spaces. In fact, there are some already in the works. And so with that, I will hand it over to Linda.
All right. Hi, folks. It's so nice to be here. This is not my usual parks and open space crowd, and so I've really enjoyed talking to a couple of you just to learn a little bit more about the work you do, and I think please come and talk to me because we are looking for partners like you all in this room to just do the work that we're doing. I'm going to zoom out at this point, way out, and talk a little bit about, just kind of pick up some of the themes that these two cats have shared here today. But just to set the stage again, parks, so TPL's mission is land for people. And we are all about trying to help people experience the joy of being outdoors when they have really high-quality outdoor spaces. And we know that this is possible because when you are outside, you know, you feel inspiration, you feel your mental health is kind of dialed down a little bit. Obviously, the physical health is there, but increasingly now we know that parks are also superpowers because they can be climate resilient spaces, super hubs. They are also about building community and building more social cohesion. So I love having conversations with mayors and elected officials who are saying, well, you know, I'm trying to deal with public safety. I've got, you know, kind of distrust in government. People aren't highly polarized society. My solution to that is let's build more parks and let's look at where you have parks, where can we improve your parks, because I can show you the evidence of what happens when people have really good access to high quality outdoor spaces. They begin to trust their neighbors, they begin to open themselves up, they're looking for opportunities to build community in their neighborhoods. And so we are very, very, we're obsessed with parks. We've been doing this for 50 years, working directly with communities. Our mantra is really that we wait to be invited in by communities who say, look, we're starting to understand that parks are very special places. They may be, you know, our kids are playing there, but they are also parts of our identity. So when I'm talking about parks, it's from neighborhood parks, state parks, all the way out to federal parks as well. All of you have a beloved national park that you love. That is also what I talk about. That's also what I have in mind when I'm talking about parks. So for us, the metric that is really important is the 10-minute walk. You saw a reference that these guys have talked about who has access to a park within a 10-minute walk of where they live. Our data shows that 100 million people, this is 1/3 of the US population, does not have a park within a 10-minute walk of where they live. Our data also shows that parks in neighborhoods where people identify as Black, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islander, tribal nations and indigenous lands, those parks tend to be half the size as parks in communities that are predominantly white households. They're half the size, and they also serve 5 times more people. So we released this data when the pandemic was among us, and you guys remember how everybody was trying to stay like 6 feet away from everybody to be safe. The crowding in parks became a real issue because everybody's trying to stay safe, you're trying to get together with the people that you miss and that you love, and when everybody else is in your park and you realize, wait, if I go to a park in a different neighborhood, there's so much more space, it looks nicer, the amenities are nicer. Those are real, that's a legacy of our disinvestment and the redlining and the systemic racism that we continue to see in this country. So that is what we and our good partners here at WRT have been really trying to focus on, just finding those places where there has been historic disinvestment, historic disenfranchisement, and really trying to revitalize those community through parks. So these guys talked a lot about data. If you have a fantastic team like John and Peter, please bring them into your community because they can do this deep dive analysis that they did in Fresno. Another way to get started, you can go to ParkServe, it's tpl.org/ParkServe, type in your city, and you will see immediately where all your parks are and who has 10-minute walk access to the parks and who does not. We also bring in a lot of other data to just help you. I like to think about it as kind of the paper version of cities and their park systems. So we also include information from the EPA. We look at household income, race and ethnicity, linguistic isolation, access to a vehicle, education levels. We also look at, we have information from the CDC, self-reported physical activity levels, self-reported mental health levels as well. We are testing a flood data set right now, which I hope is better than it was a couple of years ago. And I'll just point out something that these guys also mentioned is schools. So schools are one of these just fantastic assets in every community. They are parks hiding in plain sight. So John mentioned, and also Peter both mentioned, something called a joint use agreement. I just want to reiterate the real power of that. A joint use agreement is an agreement between a school district and a park system, typically, whereby those schoolyards can be open to the public as public parks after school hours. And so TPL has a whole program. It's a schoolyards initiative where we work directly with the school district, with the principals, with the students. We go through a student-driven and student-led design of the schoolyard. If you guys think a little bit about the schoolyards in your neighborhoods, as John was pointing out with his fantastic Burger King building, a lot of schools look like jails, and they're very institutional facilities, and they don't need to be like that. And not only that, they are mostly asphalt. And so you can break that up, bring kids in with their fantastic ideas. Every kid wants a pool first, always, and then you kind of walk them back from the pool. But inevitably, you get to a climate-smart, kid-designed park, where it is helping to mitigate extreme heat, helping to manage flood. It's bringing in pollination, bringing in biodiversity, and also it is a fantastic opportunity to teach kids about infrastructure and green infrastructure. And why are we designing the school in this way? And why would we put the trees here? And oh, look, what does it feel like when you're standing underneath canopy or you're standing on this asphalt? So there's a real potential here to continue. I mean, hopefully all of us are thinking about this next generation that follows us and what we should be doing to just build that path for them. And the schoolyard conversion is a fantastic way to do it. So in this ParkScore tool, we include schools so that you can see where there's an opportunity to also bring greening to your neighborhood through schoolyards. These guys also mentioned something that we manage called the ParkScore Index. So we rank the 100 largest cities by population based on how well their park systems are doing. So if you live in one of the 100 largest cities, you can pull up ParkScore, where we look at 5 categories. We're looking at acres, access, amenities, investment, and equity. And when you look at a place like San Diego, one of the things that you'll have easy access to are these fantastic maps. So very similar, not nearly as sort of super sophisticated as what the WRT crowd can put together for you. But this gives you a really quick sense for, well, what am I dealing with? Where are there opportunities? Which neighborhoods could I begin with? So you'll see on the left-hand side, just access. Who has access? Again, this is the 10-minute walk access. And who does not. And then on the 2 maps on the right-hand side, we show you the breakdown based on race and based on income. So you very quickly get a sense for which neighborhoods have access. And frankly, for us, this is about finding partners. So what I don't want to, I guess I'm trying to, I would love to just reiterate also how important it is to begin with, where are the strengths in these communities? What's going really well? Where are there community-based organizations that have built strong connections, good networks? Where are these anchor institutions? Because that's where you begin the park improvement journey. Who's doing what? What's important to them? And you know, WRT does this so well. It's always about finding local partners on the ground who are doing the work. And you know, they could be interested in things. Often we don't start our conversations about, where's your favorite park? Where do you want more parks? It is, well, what's important to you in this community? And often we hear things like, well, our kids are running around, they don't have anything to do. You know, school's done, and then they're just kind of milling around. So that's one, youth engagement. Often it is also about workforce development. We hear a lot about housing and the affordability of housing. We hear about local business development. There's a lot of conversations on just health, you know, specific populations that may be struggling with specific chronic disease. And those are such great points of departure because park systems can also help to solve many of those issues. So when you're gathering together and trying to find all your partners, it's such an ever-expanding pie, if you will, of just opportunity. So some of the tools that we build, we have a program that we run called Climate Smart Cities. And what we do is bring, you know, different stakeholders together who are all trying to understand better how you use land differently and how you can revitalize land. So in this case, for this program in particular, we have kind of a guiding rule, well, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a framework. We think about places to cool, connect, absorb, and protect. So where might spaces in the city of Los Angeles, in this case, offer those things? And here then, you can see we grabbed data on vacant lots, parking lots, let's see, zoning, LA River, pretty much whoever is at the table, they tell us what their priorities are. We go and we grab that data. So whatever is publicly available, we grab it. In this case, the city of LA has fantastic spatial data. We'll also, talk to the LA County, also great data. And what happens is you start to just stack those priorities, and very quickly, people in the room start to understand, actually, there are many parcels that all of us care about, that if we take action on that parcel, we can meet many, many, many objectives at the same time. So brownfields really come into play here too, because there's just a tremendous opportunity to think about, well, brownfield remediation for what purpose, toward what end, and for whom. And so this is a really nice way to sort of bring more people to the table to help advocate for that brownfield revitalization. So that's one tool, and then I think, and then this is just another example, zooming out at the city scale. We do a lot of open space planning as well. And so same basic idea. TPL does a lot of land acquisition. And so we're always trying to add to the public lands database. And so in this case, we worked with a bunch of partners looking at the San Gabriels. In this case, it was a lot of acquisition. They're trying to think about how to be proactive around fire. So we were sort of thinking about, where are the where's the highest risk of catastrophic fire? But also, where are there going to be catchment areas? So when fire does happen, where can everybody be ready around catchment areas, sedimentation flows, all of that. And then also, let's think about any other species of concern, areas of concern. The Nature Conservancy has a really great data set on climate resilient hotspots, so we also want to be aware of those. In this case, we also were trying to, so because we're TPL, we always want to make sure that people don't get left out of these conversations, and it's not always just about wildlife and habitat and critters, which are important, but people need to be able to access these spaces and also be advocating for them. But we also mapped, I think this one, routes, so public transit routes to San Gabriel Mountain trailheads. There's a national monument up there as well, and so we wanted to just make sure that people always, that everybody kept in mind that we want people to access these places as well. And again, that's a bit of the asset mapping that we always try to do. So where are people, where they're community-based organizations, what's already happening, where there's a lot of trust and momentum in these communities, because that's a big part of what we want to do to help build that case for parks. And then, I can't say enough about we're just working together. The Measure P funding and then a lot of the public funding, so TPL has a big team that works on ballot measures. So what often happens is we begin with the data, we build a tool, elected officials, community-based members start to go, wow, there's so much we can do here. And look at these neighborhoods that have parks, look at these that don't have parks. You bring in a great team like WRT to do these, condition assessments, site assessments, just to get a sense for what is actually the condition, what is the perception for people when they're in that park? Do they feel like they belong there? Do they feel safe there? All that information begins to come together and you start to build the movement. And people are armed with data and they start talking to each other. And then the elected officials realize, aha, our communities care about this. And for us, that's when we tend to come in, we start to work with the elected officials to present to them all the different options for how a ballot measure might pass. And so we actually write the ballot language, and for us, equity is at the center of all of that because we try to really hold community at the center of everything we do. So it is about funding to historic disinvestment neighborhoods. It is about using data that reveals some of these historic vulnerabilities that have been placed on people through our sort of, institutionalized racist systems. And so when you have good data and when you have trust and when you have partners at that room, you can move mountains. And the funding that we have been able to put on the ballot measure today. It is the biggest number that TPL has. We've raised $90 billion in about 30 years of conservation finance ballot measures. And the remarkable thing is that these measures pass in red states and in blue states, because when you get people around a table and you just start talking about what's happening in their community and you point to the opportunity that Parks and Green Space can offer as a solution, people start to go, yeah, that's exactly right. We all want these things. So it has been constantly inspiring and eye-opening and just pleasantly surprising, just remarkable to see these measures pass in these communities that are otherwise very, very highly polarized. And I'll just leave you with, again, so we're obsessed with schoolyards. This is one of these lovely schoolyards somewhere in Philadelphia. I don't know, it could be a dead park. It is actually a schoolyard. I think it's in Philadelphia, and that is the possibility. So I think that's my last slide. That's what I'll leave you with. Yeah.
Thanks to the panel. This is our wrap, and I was just going to put a little bow on it to say we're really glad to be able to talk parks with y'all this morning over your coffee. I think a couple of threads here that was just really relevant was while parks are very much our passion, there's a whole data side to parks that is just really important, I think, to accomplish the work and to cut through actually some of the passion and the politics in order to just really demonstrate need, leverage our data sources around our equity factors, whatever they may be, whether that's a Cal Enviro screen or the issues that are really important in your community. Identify those, talk about them with the community, because in fact, they're going to appreciate that level of detail, and I think that advocacy that they're going to see in a very analytical approach. And parks are definitely, part of our reinvestment, whether it's through equity, whether it's, and I think the approach of finding your partners and your constituents in your community. It can't be you alone as an elected, it can't be you alone as a staff, or certainly as a consultant, but who are those advocates that are working at the front lines of health or food insecurity out in the community that also know their partners and can help fight, because that's not always our position that we can take within our projects. How do you build some of those bridges? And just lastly, that Fresno is not unlike so many places across our country that's really suffered disinvestment. A lot of segregation, disinvestment, particularly in public infrastructure, but that is also really starting to turn. That whether it's the political shift or it's just a recognition of health, and I think we're all doing a better job of understanding health as at the root. Health of our communities at the root of a lot of what we do. I hope that you see parallels to just other places across our globe. So thanks for that. We have a couple minutes that I would love to, if you have a particular story or ideally even a question that you'd like to ask any of our panelists, we would love to engage with you for just a couple more minutes. Any burning thoughts, questions out there? I see a hand. Ignacio.
Right, so...
And we do have a mic, but if you're shy, we'll work with you.
So many communities, when you reach out regarding parks, particularly cities, of course, Measure P addresses maintenance, but for maintenance, there may be partnerships that help with some parts of maintenance and some improvements, but some aspects which the city absolutely has to take over. So can you think of maybe how you can partner for the maintenance aspects of parks?
Yeah, and I would want to if I didn't adequately do that, just credit the city's staff and their departments that are integral to a parks master plan and to that process, including walking parks with maintenance staff in order to understand how they're deficient. And what we find always is that maintenance staff are often the most dedicated folks. You're walking around and you see them stop and pick up some garbage as they're mid-sentence as they're talking to you. Their challenge is just that they lack an advocate. They lack funding for their department. And so I think through these Parks Master Plan processes, when you do it well, you're actually not just building community capacity, which we spent a lot of time talking about today, but you're actually building department capacity as well, both in terms of funding, but just also in terms of clarity of mission, and that they understand that their work is impactful, that they understand that they have political support, that they understand that they have community support. So I think those are few thoughts, I think, kind of related to staff guidance on the maintenance front.
I think I failed to mention with Measure P, money is often, money and partnership, both. Partnership sometimes is filling a funding gap. But Measure P does include a set-aside percentage for maintenance, which I think is really important, and acknowledges what you pointed out, which is that often there are funding sources for, creating a project, but maintaining it over time is a big challenge.
Yes, good afternoon, good morning. I'm sorry.
I'll talk loud. I have a big voice. Is Measure P a state issue?
Okay.
We have somebody right behind you.
We'll take your question first, and the gentleman at the microphone, just 1 second. And then, so Measure P is a local tax measure within the city of Fresno. And it was voted on by city residents and passed in order to fund parks. It was not a state measure. Yeah, thank you. Gentleman at the microphone, thank you.
Yes, parks can also be incredibly political, surprisingly. One of the most inspiring examples that I've seen of how that's resolved is in Detroit, where their parks department incorporated a park right in the middle of downtown that there was a lot of pushback about including basketball courts because that would bring a bad element. But they wind up incorporating a park downtown right next to the Class A office buildings, higher income area that opened up the parks to the community that bordered this downtown area. And it wound up being extremely successful. No incidents, all of the perceptions that it would bring a bad element were put to rest. But what's your all's experience with the politics of parks, particularly when it borders a higher income neighborhood, lower income neighborhood? Some people might want pickleball, others might want basketball courts, and it does get political.
All of the best and the worst of society all plays out in a park. If you watched Parks and Rec, which I can't watch because it's way too real. And so, yeah, just thank you for your comments. And the only things I would add is you said pickleball, which is just a whole thing that happens across our country right now. But I think the more the other point you mentioned was basketball courts, and that's one that just in a meeting earlier this week, I was hearing staff folks say, well, we don't want a full court basketball. We just want a half court. And it was just like, are we still talking about they can't have a full court basketball? Because it's not about the space, it's not about the ball going out into the street. It's still things that we have to overcome about who we're providing for in our parks. And you just gotta keep pushing back on that stuff. So thanks for saying basketball. That's one that really drives me crazy.
John, if you could just take a moment to talk about the park funding guide that you'll be working on with CClear, and people have been getting a survey, and if you could remind them and explain what we'll be doing with that data.
Excellent segue. Thanks, Jean. So CClear has taken the initiative to kind of go to the next step to think about how do we begin to fund parks and to help communities, especially, I think, smaller, less resourced communities, to understand first, are there funds out there that help us transform existing land, whether it's brownfield, whether it's not a brownfield, but how do we invest in parks as part of a complete community? And but also, I think the steps it takes and the both kind of vision that you need to have, the partnerships that you need to have, and to be able to tell that story in a pretty clear and concise guide for how to invest in parks. So kudos to CClear for really wanting to take that on. We're thrilled to support that. And that process is really just getting started. So we're shaping kind of what this tool looks like. And we're crowdsourcing, in fact, to ask you all to help us. Hey, if you were trying to put together a park, if you were trying to think about an open space, what should this tool look like? And so we have we're going to be tapping a number of key partners. Actually, Linda in the Trust for Public Land is going to be one of those folks advising this process. I did mention that, right?
No.
Okay.
Yes. It's going to be great.
Totally on board. And you all as well. And so a survey is being sent out via, I think it's an email link, but also I think through the app. You got a sneak peek at what that email will look like last night, but AI conspired and somehow there was a missing link. So you're going to get that email again with a link, and we really invite your insight and your feedback. So thank you all.
Question for you, Linda. You mentioned climate risks like heat and flood a lot in talking, and I'm curious, maybe with this funding report or otherwise, if you're seeing that as an effective way to elevate the need for parks, and is that changing the game on funding that can be directed there?
Yeah, so yes. I think every year we break records for extreme heat, right? So this year is the hottest on record. I'm just going to say next year is probably going to be even hotter. And definitely as we start to uncover evidence of what it is, what happens to learning for kids as they're trying to learn in these environments of extreme heat, that gets a lot of attention. When we unfortunately track hospitalizations and ER visits that are linked to extreme heat, that also gets a lot of attention. I think it is also the case that heat is the #1 weather-related killer of people in this country. So these are terrible statistics that the media loves to grab onto that, fortunately, unfortunately, we try to take advantage of to sort of show people like this is actually really important. People are dying. And it has actually driven a lot more funding. So I'll also give a shout out to the EPA for just being really thoughtful as they're helping develop, as the federal government is helping to develop tools, basically. CJEST is one example, but we've been in conversations with the White House Council on Environmental Quality to help them think through all the different data sets that sit behind the CJEST. And also to insert language into federal policy funding mechanisms that address not just historic disinvestment, but also maybe extreme heat. So certainly from the private sector, we're seeing a lot more funding opportunities from family foundations, institutional funders who are themselves finally feeling the effects of extreme heat and realizing that in fact they can do something about it. So some of the data, I think from NOAA shows like there's a park in Washington, D.C., if anybody is familiar with it, but it's a deep green park. It's one of the largest parks in D.C., but in the center of the park, it is 17 degrees cooler than outside of the park. And our own We have an urban heat island data set as well for the country, and we see that within that 10-minute walk radius outside of a park, they can be as much as 6 to 8 degrees cooler. So canopy is real in terms of the mitigation effect that it can have, absolutely.
All right.
Let's talk time and money, because we're talking about brownfields. So you have two sets of unique problems coming together at the same time. You've got remediation, extraordinarily high, understandably, extraordinarily high barriers to entry to reuse their property for anything. But then you also have parks, which someone else said is clearly very political. It's extraordinary to me. My company works to rehabilitate properties, mostly for parks, but for other public purposes. And one of the greatest challenges we have are, quite frankly, local and state staff, because there's fear. It's fear of political blowback from both the electorate and from elected officials. And I can't tell you how many times we have been turned away from projects because the government staff don't want to take on the risk. And if they do, the costs and the timing are phenomenal. I've worked across the country, and okay, it's California, I get it, but it is mind-boggling how long it takes to get something done. John F. Kennedy's famous moon speech was in 1962. He said, by the end of the decade, we'll make it to the... We did by 1969. 7 years, we got to the moon. But if you want to build a park on a brownfield in California, you better plan on at least 15 years. There's a huge problem that there are opportunities that are being missed. It's nice to say there's a great need for a park in the neighborhood, but if you can't actually do anything with it, there's going to be a need in 15 years, in 30 years. We would love to work on capped landfills. We've been flat out told by regulators, by engineering companies, absolutely my attorneys, forget it, not going to happen in California. Parks are on landfills across the country, and they used to be in California, but you have thousands of acres. Can't touch it. So I just throw that as a challenge that it's nice to say, yes, we have opportunities for parks, but the reality is the system is set up that you really can't move forward very easily and without extraordinary expense and extraordinary amount of time. So it's a challenge that I'm putting out to you and to everyone else is have to change the mindset and advocate for a new way of doing business in order for this to really bear fruit.
Yeah, you really point out good challenges, and it definitely takes a lot of energy to get things done. So I'm glad you're doing the good fight. I hope that you find alignment with some elected officials and staff and community members, because I think in my experience we have bypassed or at least sped up the timeline. Maybe it's worth chatting a little bit more, like some examples that I'm seeing and thinking of that there was a little bit more capacity within the organizations to pull through and to actually remediate the site and get things done. But yeah, it's a long road sometimes.
And one last comment on that, and this is kudos to C-Clear and to yourself. In the LA basin, there are, someone else can tell me what the exact numbers, 143, 148 municipalities. Every one of those is a jurisdiction. If you've got a staff of 15 people, they don't know, they don't have the capacity to take on something like this. It might be okay to work with the city of LA, but there needs to be TPL providing technical support, C-Clear, others to these smaller communities that may have a brownfield, but they just can't. They can't deal with it. They're just trying to get the grass cut on the parks they have, let alone remediate a brownfield. They just can't do it. That's all.
That's such a great point. And one thing I would encourage everybody working in these projects is, we were just talking last night, we're trying to build out an evaluation approach for TPL so that we can understand the impact of our work. But we're trying to take a page from environmental markets and where that is heading, which is to offer a package of outcomes that are coming from these projects. So environmental outcomes, community outcomes, learning outcomes, academic outcomes, and sort of so that we can start to also bring in private equity. We have not
we are not yet nearly as sophisticated as we could be around private financing for these public infrastructure projects. And if we can demonstrate a return, then there is a lot of interest there. So it not just, here there was this contaminant in the soil and now it is not there. If you zoom out and think about that ecosystem of habitat and the collection of habitat function that you have returned through remediation, those are the type of packages of outcomes that we think some private equity investors are more interested in that can help us speed and shorten that timeline. So that's just one way, like many different other tactics that we just need to get creative on. But it's a really good call out.
Also great segue to that, back to that funding tool. It sounds like there's some components in that guide that your comments can help motivate us towards solutions. So thank you, everybody. We are officially wrapped up, and I'm going to hand the mic back over to Ignacio.